Great to be with you guys. My name is Bobby and I'm an alcoholic. I've been through your 12 steps of Alcoholics Anonymous as they're laid out in this book. I actually had a pretty revolutionary style spiritual experience. It was pretty amazing. And I know that it was through no power of my own. It was by God's grace and it was the guidance of a sponsor who had done the same before me. If you know me, you know that I could probably speak for hours on any particular part of the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous. That's how profound this book is to me and the experiences that I've had, not only while I was going through, but even after, and the experiences I continue to have today as I try and practice these principles in all my affairs. Mark, thank you for inviting me here, and happy anniversary again. It was wonderful to hear that the other night in the meeting on Monday night. That's absolutely monumental. My sobriety date's June 4, 1986, so I'm not as seasoned as Mark is, but I can tell you that my sobriety date, although it's important and it's pretty monumental in the fact that my body was separated from alcohol, is small in comparison to the date that I got on my knees and I did my 7-step through the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous in this process in the Hyannis format. And that would be in 2012. So, in other words, I spent a great many years in Alcoholics Anonymous suffering from spiritual sickness. And as a result of sufferings from spiritual sickness, I was loaded with what we're speaking to tonight. I was loaded with resentments, and on the heels of those, of course, were fears. So when I got to the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous, I was dying in the halls. My sponsor took me judiciously through the book, chapter by chapter, title by title, paragraph by paragraph, line by line, and I can tell you that I was so spiritually sick and lacked God consciousness at such deep levels, and I was so full of self, and the bondage of self was on me like a wet T-shirt, that I really didn't understand anything that he was telling me about the big book. It made no sense to me. When I first got sober, they said the book is here for two reasons. If you can't go to a meeting, read the stories in the back. It'll be like going to a meeting. That's somewhat true. They said if you can't go to sleep at night, read the book. It'll put you to sleep. And that was really true when I first got sober. But the wonderful thing about the big book step study process is that once you have an experience, whether it's monumental, revolutionary in style, or even educational variety, is that the book comes to life. And that's what happened to me. So I didn't understand the implications of the third step of Alcoholics Anonymous and what I was about to do. I actually think that for some of us, there should be like a little line with an asterisk on the bottom of page 63 that says, please fasten your seatbelts because you're about to go for one hell of a spiritual ride. And that's what happened to me. So when I got to this part of my writing, I can tell you that I was so desperate, so dying, and my life was falling apart, sober, riddled with the bedevilments, sober, so disconnected from God, sober, and just wanted to check out. I didn't want to be here anymore. My wife was ready to hit me with divorce papers. My business was suffering really, really bad. Friendships were almost non-existent. I thought that Alcoholics Anonymous was a fail, and I was not drinking and going to meetings for a great many years and trying to do everything they told me to do by suggestion. And I found myself in a position where I was experiencing powerlessness and unmanageability in a way that I'd never experienced before. This part of the inventory, just the first part of the inventory, explained or started to reveal to me what my exact problem was. It had really very little to do with alcohol. Alcohol was a symptom. It had everything to do with the disconnect from God. And rightly so in the reading tonight. It says when the spiritual malady is overcome, we straighten out mentally and physically. And that's what needed to happen to me. When I look at the fourth step of Alcoholics Anonymous, it simply reads, made a searching and fearless moral inventory of myself, of ourselves, which simply means that there's something wrong with me morally. And I need to search out these flaws. In previous chapters, it speaks to the idea of pitiful and incomprehensible demoralization. And that's a nice way of saying, I'm going to do things that I swore I would never do. And that's exactly what I did. A lot of it was while I was sober. And I was so riddled with guilt, shame, and remorse and wanted to check out so badly sober that I was desperate to do anything. I wish the Big Book Step Study process by the Hyannis format were in the state of Rhode Island when I got sober in 1986. It was already taking shape and forming out on the Cape, just a short ride away from us. But the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous was always pushed into the closet when I got sober. It wasn't something that they really spoke to. They read the promises, they read how it works, and that's all well and fine. But I really that didn't do anything for me. I needed to have some type of experience. So when my sponsor and I got on our knees and we did the third step prayer together, we're holding hands. I'm north of 26 years sober. He's 16 years sober. I thought it was really hokey, really weird. But I was desperate, and I said, I'll get on my knees and I'll hold your hands and I'll do this third step prayer. And I did it. As soon as I got up off the floor, we went back to the table. We were meeting and in the consultation room at our design shop, and he gave me the first part of the writing. Now, a lot of people in Big Book Step Study don't get this first part of the writing, but he had me do what was called the timeline, and I answered two different questions. Where was I and who was there? And it was a wonderful way to get into the fourth step of Alcoholics Anonymous, because for a guy like me who's so disconnected from God, with a mind that is filled with those worldly clamors, as Bill speaks to in his story, there was no way that I could actually just stop. I just couldn't. So with this timeline, I was able to do a couple of different things. One, really focus on different parts of my life. Two, he said, I want you to include the name God, and I want you to put yourself on that list too, because God was always there and you were always there too. So it started to bring about a bit of accountability for me and the understanding that even though this was my inventory, God was still a part of this as well. And I needed God to be a part of this. The greatest piece of information he gave me was the idea that I was going to ask God for help. And I was so desperate that I did the full third step prayer in full form sometimes. Sometimes I just simply said, God, please just push my pen. God, please give me the information needed to discover the truth about myself. And the deeper and deeper I got into my inventory, the more I started to understand what the problem was. Now, if Mark said to me tonight, or Eric said to me tonight, I want you to go write 100 resentments, I can bang those out in a heartbeat. I'm great at writing resentments. I'm great at holding resentments. I'm great at harboring resentments. I'm great at fertilizing resentments and making sure that I'm going to use their raw and destructive energy. That's my a natural state. That's my nature as someone who's disconnected from God. And a wonderful thing about listing these resentments for me was that it was starting to relieve some of the pressure that had been built up in me over the years. And I didn't realize how much pressure was there. So listing the resentments, although it was relieving the pressure, what I came to understand was that was simply a mechanism of bringing me to the next part of the writing, which was going to actually expose every bit of truth that I needed to know about my nature, about my constitution, about what I am without God. And I needed to get to that part of the inventory. Now, I did my inventory on legal pads. I didn't do them on the notebooks with the binding and things like that. I'm left-handed, so that thing drives me nuts. And a legal pad has always worked for me. And as somebody who's always been involved in the courts and trouble and shit like that, legal pads just seem to be natural. What I love about legal pads is sometimes when you buy them, on the top it says the word evidence if you happen to buy that brand. And that's exactly what I was trying to discover. I was trying to discover the evidence of my spiritual sickness. I didn't know all this stuff. Everything that I've spoken to you from the time that I started speaking 7 minutes ago till now, I knew nothing of when I started this inventory. It was all that I came upon as a result of doing the inventory. So I listed my resentments. I can tell you that I wrote my entire fourth step in 23 days. That's how blisteringly painful the position I was in was. I wrote my inventory 6, 8, 10, 12 hours a day, depending on the level of pain that I was experiencing and the level of desperation to get through this process. That little bump that was on my finger when I was in high school from writing all those years that had disappeared as a result of becoming an adult and living life came back while I was writing my inventory. That's how fiercely I was doing this. That bump is still stuck in that finger. It's just not going away all these years later. And I'm actually good with it because it's a great reminder of what it was like. So I listed these resentments. My sponsor gave me the information as I was going along. He would give me the directions. He gave me the part about the turnarounds, what we hold to our heart in that word turnarounds. He gave me the idea of answering these 4 questions and putting out of my mind the wrongdoing of others, fancied or real. Huge important part there, fancied or real, because a lot of this shit in my mind was imaginative and delusional and a direct result of being delusional. And he gave me a series of questions that I would apply to each one of these resentments after listing the areas of my life that were affected. I never understood that resentments affected my life until I started writing this inventory. I knew that they were a driver. I knew that I used their raw energy. I knew that I could harness that energy and try and accomplish good things. But it was all by self-will and self-propulsion, and all of it landed in a place of futility, as they speak to here. Living a life as the grouch in the brainstorm, it simply wasn't working for me anymore. So he gave me this series of questions. The first one, selfishness. Second one, dishonesty. Third one, self-seeking. Fourth one, fear. When he asked me to answer the question about selfishness, he just simply said, "What did you want?" It was really that simple, right? When he got to the question about dishonesty, he simply said, "I want you to tell me what the lie is that you told yourself. How were you dishonest with yourself? What was the story that you made up in your mind? What was the false narrative that you attached to this resentment in this instance?" And then he said, "I want you to follow it with the simple question, was it the truth?" Now, the thing about listing the delusion and the false narrative and the lie that I was telling myself was that it was starting to break away and chip away at this wall and this facade that I had built around myself for so many years. They speak to the mask that we're going to take off while we're doing this. And that's what was happening when I was answering the second question, the lie that I was telling myself. It was chipping away at that facade and that mask that I had put on. And answering the question, was it the truth, with either yes or no, was a brilliant way of starting to see whether I was answering the question in the right manner or if I was doing it wrong. Because if I answered the question, was it the truth, with the word yes, that means I did not find the lie that I was telling myself. But if I answered the word with the question with the word no, it probably means that I found that lie, right? The third part was that self-seeking behavior, which was simply what was the action I took. And I can tell you my entire life built around resentment, living by resentment, was I was always in a position of thinking that people were stepping on my toes, and that not only that, but they were always in a state of retaliation. But what I came to understand about answering the question, what was the action I took, was that I was the one that was always in a position of offense. I was always in the one that was protecting myself from harm from others. And typically I was stepping on the toes of my fellows. And when I started answering these questions, I was absolutely blown away. Now, I didn't think that I had any fear in my life. I had been living by fear my entire life, but I just didn't know at what depth, and I didn't know how deep these fears were ingrained in me. So that last question, fear, I was just simply answering the question, what was I afraid of? And I was absolutely blown away at some of the answers when it came to the fear. And you'll speak to that next week. Some of the fears, at one turnaround, I would answer the question, what was I afraid of? And I would put fear of success. And then in the next turnaround, what was I afraid of? And I'd put fear of failure. And I would sit there and I would shake my head. I would boggle my mind, like, what the heck? How can I have these opposing fears? They just didn't make sense to me. Now I can tell you that as I got deeper and deeper into my inventory, most especially this part of the inventory, a few things were happening to me. I was starting to understand the exact nature that I had been living by. I was starting to understand my constitution. I was starting to understand that lack of power was my dilemma, and this was all the result of my lack of power, my lack of trusting and relying on God. And that was not an easy pill to swallow. That was a bitter pill to swallow. I can't count the number of times that I would answer those 4 questions in the turnarounds. And when I answered those questions, I picked up my pad and threw it across the room. And I just launched this thing over to the other side of the room because I was becoming disgusted with myself. Now, I think the 4th step of Alcoholics Anonymous is designed to do just that. It is there to show me my absolute failure, but while showing me my absolute failure, it's also showing me just how badly I need this power greater than myself. So there were 2 things that were going on. While I was becoming disgusted with myself, I was also starting to agree with the 3rd step of Alcoholics Anonymous in principle. I was starting to understand that I needed this power greater than myself as a governor in my life. I needed to learn how to trust and rely on God. I also came to understand the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous started to come to life to me. Even if I just look at the 12 steps on a wall in an AA meeting when they speak to the idea of being powerless over alcohol in my life as unmanageable, I wasn't powerless over alcohol when I started the 4th step of Alcoholics Anonymous. Alcohol wasn't my problem. I'd been sober for north of 26 years. Yes, I'm powerless over alcohol. I'm powerless over spiritual sickness. I'm powerless over alcoholism. I'm powerless over this separation of God, separation from God. I'm not my life isn't unmanageable as a result of drinking at this point. My life is unmanageable as a result of spiritual sickness. So when I read the 1st step of Alcoholics Anonymous, I start to see that my life will always be an extension of my thoughts. And my life is unmanageable because my thoughts are absolutely trashed. They're riddled with selfishness and self-centeredness. The bondage of self twists my mind in a way that I just don't understand until I do this work. And then even in the 2nd step of Alcoholics Anonymous, speaking to the idea of being restored to sanity. I always thought that I had been restored to sanity just because I didn't drink anymore. And I'm not drinking and I'm going to AA meetings and I'm doing all the things you're telling me to do. What the piece of information that was missing for me was the idea that while I was experiencing a pitiful and incomprehensible demoralization, I still held the belief that I had the power and the mind power to fix the problems in my life, most especially my defects of character, shortcomings, and flaws. And I was just simply wrong. If I could fix my own defects of character, if I could gain mastery over these resentments on my own power, I wouldn't need Alcoholics Anonymous. I wouldn't need the 12 steps of Alcoholics Anonymous. I wouldn't need God. That's the reason I'm here in Big Book Step Study, is because I found that I needed God more than anything in my life because I never had the power over all of these things. There are pages torn out of my book, and it's always the 4th step of Alcoholics Anonymous. These are the pages that are worn the thinnest. These are the pages that are marked up the most. There's a couple things that I'm going to touch on in here because I know I don't have much time left. I touched on that fancied or real. There were a lot of resentments in my life that were imaginative. I used them as a mechanism to protect myself from further damage. I uncovered that in my writing. They speak to the idea that we saw these resentments must be mastered, but how? If you want to learn how to master a resentment in Alcoholics Anonymous, go through the Hyannis format of the Big Book Step Study process, and you will be shown how to master a resentment by actually writing on your resentments. Because the wonderful thing here is after I do my turnarounds and I list that fear, then I go to my fear writing, and the fear writing always ends at the same place. I ask God to remove the fear of and direct my attention to what He would have me be. My mastery of resentments has everything to do with my trust and reliance on God and has nothing to do with my limited power. There's also something in here that speaks to in quotation marks. And Bill is not very liberal with quotation marks. He's not very liberal with exclamation points, but he uses the word number one resentment. And my pages are so ripped up, I can't find it. On page 64, resentment is the number one offender. Now I'm to understand it this way, and this is the way that I have to understand it. This is the way that I've come to understand it. I was born and raised with a God consciousness, and somewhere along the way I lost it. It was a childish faith. I tossed it out the door when the first resentment arrived. And from there, I started living a life of self-propulsion and self-will. Long into sobriety, right until the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous. I go through this process and I reclaim my faith and I reclaim my God consciousness. Not only that, I can grow in effectiveness and understanding when it comes to my God consciousness. I also know today that resentment is indeed a number one offender, and the offense is always against my God consciousness. It's impossible for me to maintain, practice, or live by God consciousness if resentment is present. So the number one offender to my God consciousness will always be resentment. On the top of the following page uses the words burned up. We were burned up when it was speaking to these areas of my life that are affected. It's a nice way of being told that as long as I'm resentful and I can't get free of it, and and I'm not connected to God, I'm going to live in my own type of hell. I am going to be on fire with these resentments. And from this, nothing good is going to come. It's just going to be futility and uselessness. Guys, I know that I could speak another hour on this stuff, but I can't. It's impossible. I have to stop talking, but I do want to leave you with this. I hope that I told you something that adds a little depth and weight to your experience, or if you're writing, that it encourages you to write some more. I can tell you your pen is not 1,000 pounds. It might just be 500 pounds. So just pick up the damn pen and keep writing writing this fourth step. And on the other side of all this work, you're going to find something that's just absolutely amazing. And I think you're going to find what I found and what a lot of other people at Big Book Step Study have found. We found everything that we were always looking for by following a few simple set of directions that were laid out for us by this particular format. So I wish you well, and I hope you guys live in God consciousness. Thank you so much, Mark, for asking me to be here tonight.
Awesome. Thank you, Bobby.